ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about art, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. If you like what we do and if you like this video, then please like and subscribe by looking at a link below. Now, today's guest is an American writer. She's just written her fifth book, which is about the sons of a former American president going to the Himalayas. I've read some of it, and what I've read is actually excellent, so I can't wait to read the rest of it. Her name's Nathalia Holt, and she's here to talk to me about her book now. Hello, Natalia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you.
Oh, you're welcome, you're welcome. Before we get into the crux of the book, can you just explain for those of our viewers who don't know who you are, just who you are, how long you've been writing for, and what led you to write to this current book?
So, I'm a writer of narrative nonfiction. My first book came out in, let me think, I think 2014. So, I have a PhD in molecular biology and I did research in the lab and in the field for many years. And
Mhm.
then I started writing books and I just loved it. And I've been really fortunate to build a career. I like to write about people in history whose stories have often been overlooked. And so I write a lot about women. A lot of my previous books have been about women in history. So I wrote a book called Rise of the Rocket Girls about early women in NASA, the American space program. And I wrote a book called Queens of Animation about women in at Walt Disney Studios during the classic age of animation. And I wrote a book called Wise Gals about women during the early building of the CIA post World War II period and about how those women were essential to building up American intelligence. And so this book was really interesting for me because it allowed me to write about a group of men who obviously, these are famous men. These are the sons of the 26th American president, Teddy Roosevelt, but who in many ways have not gotten their due. And so to be able to write about this expedition, and not just about them, but the other people that they explored with, was just such a privilege. It was so much fun to really dive into this small slice of history that hasn't been written about before.
Okay, good, good. Before we get onto this fifth book, because we want to do a deep dive on it, you mentioned there some of the books you've written already. So you talked about women in animation, women in the CIA, international, and so on. Now, obviously, you're getting a lot more women in the fore in terms of knowing about their history and what's happening and so on and so forth. But I know sexism could be a reason as to why we've not heard these stories before. But with all that's happened and women's stories being more prominent, I think, over the last decade, maybe it's just me, but it seems to me that there seems to be a lot more stories about women and the role they played in society that we don't know about yet. Why do you think it's taken so long for those stories to actually be told?
I think for many people, these are parts of history that just haven't been well documented. And so to write these books, it means that in many cases, you have to find the women themselves, you have to interview them, you have to look for histories that have been taken of them. So it's not ripe fruit for the picking. It takes a lot of work to dig into these stories, but they are incredibly rewarding because they shed light on periods of history that just haven't been discovered before and new perspectives. So it gives us a new way to look at some periods of time that have been written about much. So, there's been so much written about NASA, there's been so much written about World War II, Disney, and all these topics, but to be able to see it through fresh eyes and through a new perspective on history gives us more detail.
All right, cool. So you mentioned briefly in your first answer, but what compelled you to write this book? Because you talked about obviously the sons of the 26th president Teddy Roosevelt, Himalayas, and that seems great. I know, and like I said, I've read part of it. He's brilliant. What I've read, but what else was it about? Because I imagine, especially back then, there would have been a lot of mountaineering expeditions. There's still a lot of the earth to be explored, and especially new technology was coming out, so you have to document it a lot quicker than you might have been like a century or so before. So why was it specifically about this trip they thought, actually, it's not just because they're sons of presidents, there's actually more to it than this, there's more substance. The reason why you want to write it, what was that substance?
I found the environmental message of this book to be very compelling. And part of what makes it so special is that at this time in the 1920s, pandas were still largely unknown to Westerners. And the history is just crazy to me. So it started in 1869. You have a French missionary living in China, and he asks a group of hunters to go out and find him interesting animals. And so this group of hunters comes back to him with a number of interesting species, and one of them is a small cub, and it's black and white. So it looks like a small bear cub. This is not a living animal, it's a dead animal that's been hunted. And so they have this hide of this cub, and it's like nothing anyone has seen before. And this is particularly interesting because bears had been known for thousands of years in human history. We have polar bears that were part of early zoos, black bears, grizzlies, all known to humans, but the panda was not. And this has a lot to do with the panda itself. This is a very rare mammal, of course, even today. And so this French missionary sends this small hide to a natural history museum in Paris, and they kind of don't know what to do with it. It's missing part of its head. It's really incomplete. They can't really say what it is. And so they put it in to a vault in the museum and largely forget about it. But it gets this idea rolling. There is a panda somewhere out there. And then in 1916, you have a group of German hunters that really wanted to find this black and white bear. And so they go to China and they also ask hunters to help them and go find this bear. And they do. They come back with hides of a black and white bear as well as a living cub. And the Germans don't know what to do with this baby cub. They try to nurse it. They try all these different things and it ultimately dies. And so they return to Germany without any evidence of the panda at all. So the legend is starting to build. People are really starting to wonder, is this actually a real bear or not? And then in 1919, an American missionary named Joseph Milner purchases the skin of a black and white panda and he sends it to the American Museum of Natural History. And here, scientists really become intrigued because they finally have a specimen of the hide that includes the head. And so the museum announces it. They call it this rare beast from eastern Tibet. And they say nothing is known of its habitat, of its food. But yes, we think this is real. Immediately, people become very excited about this idea. All of these expeditions go out, they're eager to find the panda, to actually discover it to science, to prove that this is a real animal. And then a decade passes and no one is able to find a panda. All of these expeditions with very skilled scientists and explorers that have gone out to China, they all come back empty-handed. And so by the time the Roosevelts, the two eldest sons of President Teddy Roosevelt, decide to go out to China and do this expedition, there's not a lot of hope out there. In fact, there are some scientists who believe that this is all a hoax, that the panda isn't actually real at all. And so for the Roosevelts to go out, you can imagine that they are trying to continue their father's legacy, who was an explorer, a naturalist, someone who cared quite a bit about the environment, and really trying to find themselves. They're trying to prove themselves. They're coming in these low parts of their life when they take on this expedition. And it's just what they experience, what they find is incredibly surprising. It's not at all what you would expect.
Cool. So it's gone to the two sons. It's Kermit and Ted. Before they go on this expedition, what were they like as people and what were they doing before deciding to go to China?
So Ted and Kermit had a lot of pressure on them. You can imagine there are many advantages to being the sons of a famous man, but there are also disadvantages, and we see that when we look at their lives. So when Ted, the eldest son, was 10 years old, he had a nervous breakdown, and the doctors told his father, "It's because of you. It's because of the pressure that you're putting on him." And so Teddy Roosevelt, this great man, was an absolutely affectionate father. I mean, he was the kind of dad that would get down on the ground and play with his sons. He played these very sweet games. I talk about a game he played called Bear Hunt in the book, where he would hide in the house and his kids would go all through it trying to find him. And then when they did, he would just give them hugs and kisses and tickles and be very silly. He sent them very affectionate letters. He told them he loved them very often. But he also could put a lot of pressure on them. He wanted so much for them, and especially for Ted and Kermit, he worried. He didn't want them to become what he called weaklings. He wanted them to be strong. And so Ted has a real crisis as a child. Kermit also has many experiences that are difficult because of this. And so what we see is that both of them are really trying to become what their father would have wanted them to be, but it's not going very well. So at this point in the book, by 1920s, they are in their late 30s, early 40s, and they're struggling. So Ted has tried to follow his father's career in politics. And so he has been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which is a position his father held before becoming president. And during that time, he was involved in something called the Teapot Dome scandal, which was a scandal where oil leases were being given away in the United States in return for bribes. And even though he's not convicted, his name is tarnished forever by this. And his wife puts it clearly. She says he is politically obliterated. So, really, what he's going to do next is very unclear. He doesn't have a future in politics. And Kermit is struggling as well. So, he has a shipping business and it's not doing well. He's not a natural businessman. And in addition, he's just having difficulty in his personal life. So what we see is that when they take on this expedition, in many ways, they are trying to escape. They're trying to invent themselves anew, become something their father would be proud of. And it's something actually that their father did quite often. So when he faced difficulties, for example, when he lost the bid for the presidential election in 1912, he went on an expedition to the River of Doubt to chart a river in South America. So certainly this idea that you would take on an expedition when you're having difficulty in your life is something that they got from their dad.
Yeah, cool. So, in regards to going expedition, they've decided, well, we're going to go and do this. How do they set about it in terms of the planning stage? Because obviously they didn't have any experience of this. So, how did they recruit other people to join them? Who did they recruit? And how did they raise funds for the trip?
So they worked with the Field Museum in Chicago, and they had a wealthy businessman who was able to fund this expedition. It was not something the Roosevelts could have funded by themselves. And then they brought on people to help them. One of them was a young man, just 18 years old, who's named Tai Jack Young. He was an NYU student whose family had come from China and from San Francisco. He himself was born in Hawaii, but he'd grown up in China. And so he was to serve as the group's translator, but he was also trained in a lot of scientific technique. So he was sent to the Field Museum where he learned how to prepare specimens for exhibits, how to look for new species, many different skills he learned from the museum. And then they also recruited a man named Sudham Cutting, who was a New Yorker who had not a lot of experience. He certainly wasn't a naturalist who had worked for decades, but he had been on a few expeditions previously and he was friends with Ted and Kermit. So they got along well with him. They knew he was the kind of man that could sort of jump into anything and do well. And then they also worked with a scientist named Herbert Stevens, who was a biologist from the UK, and he'd had a string of bad luck. This poor biologist. He'd had these expeditions where his entire boat capsized full of everything he'd collected. So he'd had multiple difficulties and was really wanting to prove himself and sort of show that he could have a successful expedition and find new species. And this is a small group. This is it. This is who they're traveling with, along with a group of guides that they end up hiring in China and Tibet to help lead the way and help make camp. But they are set to travel just about 2,000 miles on foot across China on an expedition that will take 6 months.
Well, I mean, it's weird actually because 6 months seems a long time for the exhibition. If you think about today, where we have a technology where we could literally just fly over initially and then possibly get a car there up to so far and whatnot. But 6 months seems a long, long time. So they must really rack their brains to think, actually, we want to do this. And especially to somewhere as unknown as, say, China and the Himalayas, where you've not had experience. I mean, I've never climbed Mount Everest, but you see it on TV, so you know it's snow and whatnot. But they were literally going into the unknown. That'd be accurate to say.
Absolutely. So they enter China through Western China. So they're going through what is today Myanmar up into China and then kind of through the Himalayas. They're straddling that border between China and Tibet. And this whole region does not have roads to drive cars on. So they are going by foot. They have their supplies carried by a mule train, and then they have these guides to help lead the way. And they're going through areas of China that at that time were so remote, cultures that had very little contact with the rest of China. And in addition to that, China is undergoing a civil war at that time, which started in 1927 between the nationalist government and the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a lot that they're unprepared for on this trip, both in terms of the geographical limitations of hiking through the Himalayas and going through these remote areas, but also the battles that they end up finding themselves on the skirmishes of.
Mm. So what month and year did the exhibition start?
So it started in December of 1928.
Why December when you know it's winter, it's going to be cold?
So their main concern as they're traveling to China is that they're able to find the panda before the rainy season begins in May. So they wanted to give themselves enough time to be able to, because it takes many months to be able to hike where they thought the panda would be, which by the way is not at all where it turns out to be.
Mhm.
So they end up having to go much farther and into areas of China that they had previously not wanted to travel into because they were worried for their safety. And so they're trying to get as much done as they can before the rainy season begins, essentially. But certainly traveling in winter through the Himalayas presents some real challenges, as we see in the book, because this expedition really suffers through the mountains. They end up suffering from altitude sickness. They lose all their food supplies on two occasions when their mules take off in the middle of the night just because it's so cold in the Himalayas that they leave camp. And so there's just so much that happens in the snow in the Himalayas that they were not prepared for and really made this trip difficult.
Yeah, it does seem difficult, and actually that leads on to the next question, which is, what was the start of this exhibition like? Because obviously you've listed some of the things that happened to him later, but at least initially, was it a smooth running, or was there difficulties right from the off?
You know, what's funny is that their very first day on the trail, Herbert Stevens, who's the biologist on the trip, gets lost. He just leaves the trail and they can't find him. This is their first day and they're immediately panicked. Where did he go? What's happening? They search and they finally find him. And the luck of Herbert Stevens is that he's made friends and he has secured them an invitation for breakfast the next day, and everything turns out fine. But they have many difficulties with Herbert along the trail because he's constantly leaving it. He's just so intent on finding new species, and he's slow. He takes longer. And so at some point, the Roosevelts just become fed up and they say, okay, we're separating out. We're going to leave you behind. You're going at a slower pace than us, which is sad, poor Herbert, but things work out for him.
Indeed, that seems bizarre. Like, I'm all for eagerness, but to keep on leaving like the group you were behind, surely he must learn his lesson of, okay, maybe I should stick with this week and go slow and steady. But no, I think his eagerness was his downfall a little bit on that trip.
He just got so excited. He would see a species of butterfly he'd never seen that he knew was a new species, and he just would go after it. And he couldn't be stopped. He would any small animal. He loved birds. I mean, he was constantly distracted. But he he had so much passion for nature and for describing the world, and you can tell from reading his journal entries and reading his letters during this time that he was just so excited and so happy. He was finding many new species on the expedition and just really immersing himself on the trip.
Yeah. Didn't I think it was Kermit? Didn't Kermit fall ill during the trip?
He did. Yeah. Actually, both brothers fell ill. Kermit ended up having a pretty serious GI illness that set him back. And then Ted, towards the end of the book, ends up getting malaria and comes very close to death during that time. And both brothers have what they describe as the worst night of their lives in the Himalayas when they are suffering from altitude sickness and are exposed to the cold. So there's certainly some very low moments in terms of sickness during this book that you you really, as I was recreating these scenes, I was really fortunate to be able to have different accounts from each of the members of the expedition. So I was able to get the unpublished autobiography from Tai Jack Young, as well as some interviews that he had done in the 1990s. And I was also able to get the journals and letters from the Roosevelts that include a lot of details that they didn't have in their published account in 1929. And so it was really helpful to be able to get all those details of how they felt in the moment and what was going on with them and what these really low points in their life was like.
Yeah, like I say, it seems a very exciting time. And it's interesting to talk about letters because if this was happening now, the first thing a lot of people do is get their mobile phones out, get the cameras out, and then put it all on social media. Whereas I think letters give it a richness that you don't really seem to get today.
I think that's true. And the journals were very helpful as well because there are many moments where the Roosevelt brothers are vulnerable in their journals in a way that they simply are not in their published accounts of the expedition. And that makes sense, isn't it? I mean, when you're writing something that's just for yourself, you're more apt to be vulnerable and to talk about the moments that are hard and the things that you are having difficulty and your regrets. But certainly, if you were trying to recreate this expedition today, it simply couldn't be done because there are roads. It's entirely different today than it was then.
Okay, so is the area built up now? Is that predominantly still forest?
There are certainly still patches of forest, and where they ultimately found the pandas, many of those areas have been preserved. But there's roads that connect these areas today. So it's not as remote. The cultures that were once kind of preserved in these parts of China have changed quite a bit. So you see that the way that China has changed has really changed a lot of the way people live in these remote parts of China as well. And yeah, it would be impossible to recreate the expedition today. And in addition, this expedition found many new species. It discovered 19 new species. And what I found striking was that how many of those species are already endangered or extinct today in just the space of a generation. You have so many changes that have occurred with deforestation of the area, habitat fragmentation, that have really fundamentally changed this part of China.
Yeah, it's like the deforestation, gentrification of cities as well, and all sorts of stuff. It's just, I think it's accelerated it. But I imagine all those species you talk about that like nearly extinct now, I imagine they're being protected under certain laws and certain conservation points.
Well, that is certainly true for the panda. So,
Mm.
the panda went through this very difficult period. And I talk about it in the book how the discovery of the panda really led to some unintended consequences because as soon as the panda was found, people were very excited. There just was what they call a pandemonium in the US and in Europe as well. And people were very excited to go to museum exhibits to see them. And so what you have is all of these exhibits. Now that the Roosevelts had found where the panda was, they decided to send out all these new expeditions to hunt it. And this really was devastating. The Roosevelts were very upset by how their work really led to pandas being killed for these museums, as well as cubs stolen for zoos. And so there's a number of expeditions that went, took cubs from the wild, brought them back to the United States, and simply couldn't care for them. So many of these bears, in fact, all of them, died prematurely because people didn't know how to take care of them. So the Roosevelts, in response, decided that they really wanted to change laws to protect the panda, and that's exactly what they did. And so we see is that because the panda became a symbol of wildlife conservation, and laws were enacted to protect it, it ended up helping many of the other animals that it lives with in these bamboo forests.
Yeah, indeed. Just quickly, didn't I, wasn't there a blizzard on the way in terms of,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So how long
Yes,
did
there
that blizzard
was.
last and what were the lasting effects for that for the rest of the trip?
Pardon, I didn't catch that last part.
So how long did the blizzard last for and what were the effects of how did the effects of the blizzard affect the group for the rest of the trip?
So, yeah, there is this one moment in the book where they're going through these very high peaks in the Himalayas. So they're about 14,000 feet. And they're just so desperate to get what they're going that Ted decides they're going to hike during the night, which is just a terrible idea. And the guides tell him, let's not do this. We're not going to be able to see anything. We could get lost. But they do it anyway. And a blizzard ends up moving in. And they end up really not being able to protect themselves. They're not able to get tents up in time. They can't even see where to pitch a tent. So they just try to get in their sleeping bags and do as best they can. And they're at such high altitude that they're suffering from this altitude sickness. Ted describes this as the worst night of his life. And certainly it is just a night where they come very, very close to dying. It's a really difficult time. And it does. It's a time that changes them because they've never experienced hardship quite like this before. Even Kermit, who had accompanied his father on the River of Doubt and had experienced some really difficult moments during that trip, being in the Himalayas during this blizzard was such a difficult experience for him. And he talks about it in his letters about how he felt afterwards that they were starting anew. It was almost as if they were new people starting this trip. And I think that's true. I think sometimes the experiences we have during travel, especially when it's a struggle, when it's difficult, can really change us.
Indeed, indeed. And actually, you just remind me of a question I wanted to ask, which is you mentioned Kermit and Ted, who Kermit a little bit obviously went with his dad to the Amazon, but Ted especially hadn't been through anything like this before. And obviously, being a sons of a president, came from a well-to-do background. It's not like today where you could possibly do certain training, like in say United States or the UK over here, before going because you had a lot of people experience it. You just literally going on knows like no training you can do beforehand. So did they ask people for advice like before going there? Because like I say, there were people who'd been like near that area or in that area before. Did you get a chance to ask people for advice in terms of how to cope with certain things, what to take, or was it literally just here you go, let's just see where it takes us?
They asked for a lot of advice. And I don't want to make it seem as if Ted didn't have experience previously, because he did. His father had taken both of the brothers out camping and hunting multiple times. And he had also gone out on expeditions with his brother Kermit previously. It's just that this trip was so different than any of those. It was so much more difficult than anything he had done before. And Kermit, while he was more experienced, was also just overwhelmed by this trip in particular.
Mhm.
But they talked to many different naturalists, scientists, explorers before taking this journey. They were well connected in that. So they were part of the Explorers Club in New York City. They also went to the Royal Geographic Society in London. So they were able to get advice from many different men and women before going to China, as well as consulting a broad range of maps, both those made from American and European explorers, as well as those made in China itself. So they were able to get as much information as they possibly could. But not all of that advice was great. So, they had talked with several different explorers who told them in particular to avoid a part of China that was ruled by the Yi, or what they usually called Lolos, which can be considered a derogatory term today. And this was a very distinct culture that lived in part of China. It was autonomously ruled. So they would fight the Chinese government if they came close to the borders. They typically did not get along with the Chinese, and they did not consider themselves Chinese. They had a very insular culture in a region of China that was simply not connected by roads. So it was very difficult to even reach this area. And what we find is that when Ted and Kermit would ask explorers about this area, they were told time and time again, do not go there. This is where the savages are. They're going to kill you if you try to enter this region. And Ted and Kermit decide to go there mostly out of desperation because they have had zero luck finding the panda. They're traveling everywhere through China, describing the panda, trying to find people that have seen the panda. No one has seen it. No one can say yes or even has any idea what it is. It's sort of like if I was going around describing a unicorn and asking if you know where I can find it, and everyone would say, no, that's crazy. What are you talking about? I've never seen anything like that. That's a fantasy. And so they decide to go to this one land where it's ruled by the Yi people because although they have had all of these warnings not to, they feel like this might be their best chance of actually finding the panda. And in the book, I talk a lot about how, although they were warned that the Yi people were these savages, of course they're not. They're actually very kind to the Roosevelts. And in many ways, it's the Roosevelts who proved themselves to be the savages in this area because they're hunting the panda.
Yeah. The way you talk about the panda and what you said at the beginning about the timeline of this the animal, it almost seems as though back then they thought it was some Fortean creature like Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster. It seemed to have that real mythical status about it. Would that be a fair thing to say, or was it a case of, oh, we know it exists, but we just haven't seen it yet?
For much of this history, it has this mythical status. In 1919, when you have this one complete hide from a panda that's exhibited at the Museum of Natural History, is where things turn, is where scientists start to think, okay, this is real and we can go find it. But the problem, of course, is that a decade passes and nobody can find it. And so that's when you have some scientists who write in their journals that they're not sure they believe this actually exists, that this might be some kind of strange hoax or just not a real species in and of itself. And so there's a lot of doubt about the panda. You can imagine it's just such a different time than now. Um, we can these missionaries in China would get descriptions of the panda, but there's no photographs and they haven't seen it themselves. So you have people that are giving descriptions of an animal that they have not seen, trying to say that this is a new species, but until you've actually seen one, documented one, seen where it lives, seen what it eats, how can you be sure that this is real?
Yeah, indeed, indeed. You said earlier about had the lost their food supplies twice. How on earth did that happen?
Oh, I know. It's so horrible. So as this part happens, they're traveling through so many different areas of China. So they're going through at first this very lush, humid jungle, then they go through the Himalayas, then they go through the Tibetan Plateau, and they lose their food in the Himalayas, and it's because it is on the backs of mules. And usually they would unload these mules at night. But when they
Mhm.
were traveling through the Himalayas, they kept the food on the mules because they felt like it provided some insulation and some warmth. And so they didn't want to take it off these animals. Um, but the mules are in the snow with no protection, and so they break free, and this happens twice in the book, and both times it's very difficult. One time they're able to find the mules and get their food back. But the other time they're not. And this is very dangerous because now they're in the middle of these mountains without food, and they are more than a week's journey away from any neighboring town. And I mean, what are they going to do? At this point, it just seems desperate. What ends up happening is they are rescued by a group of people who are called lamas. So these are monks of Tibetan Buddhism, and they live in lamaseries, so kind of like monasteries, but for Tibetan Buddhism. And you had these lamaseries throughout these remote regions of China and Tibet. And the lamas would live there. They were brought there from when they were young. They're both men and women who are lamas. And they often served as medical doctors in these areas. So they would help people who are having difficulties. And it was very fortunate that the Roosevelts were able to find them. It's really by chance that they come across one of these lamaseries and the llamas take them in. They feed them, they give them more food. Um, Kermit's coat has been filled with holes from an accident that happened at a campfire. And so they take one of their yellow robes and they help him patch up his coat. And he jokes that he's part llama now after that experience. So they're very fortunate to have these llamas help them. And it's interesting throughout the book because what we see is that when they end up going into some towns that are uh, controlled by the Chinese government, there is a very different view of llamas because here you have the nationalist Chinese government who's seizing control of large regions of the area, and they are very critical of the Tibetans and these lamas who often are autonomously ruling these regions. And so it creates this real conflict where they're being told, oh, these llamas are terrible people, you shouldn't stay away from them. And their experience is very different. They have been rescued by them. And so it's an interesting look at what it was like in China at that time and the many different conflicting cultures.
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned, I think it was Kermit or Ted that was ill with a GI illness as well.
Hmm.
When they lost the food, would that be because of the food? Because I imagine when they lost the food before they got rescued, they might have had to have so various berries around and food like that. Did you get to that desperate before they were rescued?
No, his GI actually came in when they were traveling through an area where they were eating local food. And it's kind of, there's so many different things that he might have gotten that gave him that GI illness. But at the time, it was quite serious because he was in so much pain. And so this was actually before they got into the Himalayas, and he ends up having really relying on Jack, who is their translator, who really becomes really a member of the scientific team. And so Jack goes out and has to find a doctor, is really worried about Kermit. Everyone's concerned. And he ends up finding one who comes to Kermit, gives him a pill. They still have no idea what it is, what medicine he's being given, but it seems to work. And Kermit, for either because of this medicine or simply because of the passage of a little time, ends up feeling better. And although he's still weak, is able to continue on with the expedition. But you can imagine there's so many different illnesses that you could get on a trip like this. And so I do talk somewhat about how that worked and what it was like to be traveling during that time.
Oh, cool. Oh, when they attacked by robbers as well, is that accurate?
Yes, they were attacked by robbers. And so that's a really exciting part of the book because this attack happens, and there's a number of guides who go ahead of them on the trail.
Hmm.
And an interesting thing about these guides, so they're sort of like the Sherpa people of Nepal. These are men and women who are well trained and who really make quite a bit of money for this area by leading people through the Himalayas and through the Tibetan Plateau. And so you have this group that happens to all be women who are at the head of the trail during this time when the robbers come, and they're surrounded by guns. They end up slapping the back of a mule, which makes it rear up and head off and just causes confusion. And during that moment, they're able to get the upper hand and ultimately run down all these robbers so that they can't catch up with them later. So there's several moments that happen with bandits on the trail, and some of them are dramatic like that, and some of them are just strange. So one happens when Jack has left the expedition for a short while before he comes back. He's taking some of their supplies around a different way because they're having difficulty on the trail, and he encounters a group of robbers, and he decides to just stay calm, to keep walking, to pretend as if nothing is wrong. And the bluff works. He's able to get through that area, even though the robbers are right there with guns, and somehow manages to keep going. So even in addition to that, there's several other points with bandits too. And it's interesting to see how often that happened on the trails in China during that period of time.
Yeah, that seems very opportunistic. So it makes me feel like there was more people going on these trails that probably we even thought of because obviously they wouldn't be there if there wasn't any opportunity to steal from people then as
Yes, yeah,
well?
I talk about that in the book because there's quite a few people that, since you didn't have roads, the only way to move goods through these areas of China and Tibet was on the backs of people. And so, really, there are some crazy pictures of some of the loads of tea that these tea porters had and that they were carrying throughout China. I mean, they would travel 1,000 miles with these incredibly heavy loads of tea. And it's hard for me to even describe it. You just have to look at the picture in the book, or you can see it on my Instagram too, because it's just insane to think about what it must have been like to travel like that. But certainly during parts of these trails, there could be a lot of people going through. I mean, this was a ripe opportunity for bandits. And it was interesting for the Roosevelts too, because it allowed them to interact with a lot of different people and different cultures.
Okay, okay, cool. So lost food supply, obviously, so much. Lost food supply, went through a blizzard. The two sons became ill as well, and sickness and whatnot. And correct me if I'm wrong, but not everyone survived during this trip. Would that be fair to say?
There's a member of the expedition that did not survive, and his name was Russell Hendy. And he was a young biologist who was coming to join the Roosevelts as they went for kind of the second leg of this expedition, as they were going down to Vietnam and Laos. And he ends up catching malaria and dying. And it's a very sad part of the book because he was a young man that had so much promise and was very excited to be doing this expedition with the Roosevelts. And he wasn't the only one to get malaria. We also see that Ted had a very severe case of malaria where he lost a third of his body weight. He just becomes this frail skeleton. He's he's under 100 pounds and his brain is hardly working at all. He's very fortunate to have survived this bout of malaria. Sudum Cutting also had malaria. So certainly not everyone survives this book. However, when I wrote my subtitle for the book, where I talk about it being a deadly expedition, um, I'm actually not referring to humans there. I'm really referring to the panda. And that perhaps is what I consider the worst death in the book. It's a very moving part where we see what happens to the panda. And it takes some explanation for us to consider why someone would hunt a panda. It seems impossible by how we think of things today. And you do have to sort of go back and think of how explorers at that time felt, because there was this thinking among scientists that even for endangered animals, they had to be hunted and they had to be brought to these museums because this was the only way scientists could study them. And so that was really the thinking at the time, that even animals where there were so few members of the species left, the idea was that nature had made its choice and it was thus important to be able to study that animal back at the museum. And so that's how this thinking goes. That's why the Roosevelts are doing this. And for them, certainly hunting, conservation, biology, these are all fields that are intimately linked and are linked in a way that we don't think about today. And I do think it's kind of interesting to ponder that for a minute because there are things we do today that I'm sure future historians and scientists will find absolutely barbaric. They'll say, oh, we put tracking collars on bears. We got genetic samples through these means. We use tranquilizer guns, all these things that I'm sure future scientists will just find crazy that we did. In very much the same way that we see hunting the panda as crazy today. And it's perhaps important to note that so little was known about the panda at this time that both Ted and Kermit believed they were hunting an aggressive predator. They believed the panda was going to be an animal that combined the ferocity of a polar bear with the aggressiveness of a black bear, and that's what they thought they were pursuing in the woods. And when they discovered the truth of what the panda was actually like, it changes them. It really changes their beliefs. It changes how they approach their lives in the future. We see Kermit makes huge changes in his life as a direct result of what they find in this bamboo forest in China.
Cool. Is it a case of status as well? Because today you have people who hunt, and I don't want to encourage people to do this, but you see some disgusting pictures where people hunt an animal, say in Africa or Asia, and they'll pose with the animal, which I think is abhorrent. But it's almost like a status thing. And even in the UK here, you have, even though laws changed, you have people go fox hunting, for instance. And it seems to be a
Hmm.
status thing, like bullfighting in Spain, status. Was it similar back then? Was the pandas much about status and actually saying to people in polite society, I got the panda first, and then that would lead you up to certain ladders and certain societies, as much about that than it was about scientific research?
It absolutely was. Yeah, the two are intertwined. And the panda at that time was called the most challenging trophy animal on Earth. That's how people saw it. They saw it as a trophy animal to be hunted. And it just tells you how little we knew about the panda, that that's how it was viewed. And so for the Roosevelts, this is a clear challenge for them. There's the science of discovering the panda, but there's also the knowledge that getting to the panda first will make them famous.
Mm, mm. So how long did the exhibition take in total?
The expedition took about 6 months.
Okay. And you said it changed both, well, Kermit, what he did, and Ted. How did it change them both?
So what I found is that when I looked through their letters, when I looked through their journals, almost immediately they had regret over what happened. So it's a kind of a strange phenomenon, isn't it? Because it's you're hunting this animal, you're desperate to get it, and then as soon as you get it, it's not what you expected and it's not what you actually want. And so what we see is that in their published accounts, it's they're happy to be getting the panda, but privately, they're really quite upset about what's happened. And so they describe the panda as a gentleman, and they realize that actually what the Yi people had told them about this animal being gentle is true. And so when they come back to the United States and they're immediately celebrated for the panda, and there's all these headlines and press about it, they realize that what they've done is given all of these hunters, these big game hunters, a map to the panda. And now they're suddenly going to China with the intent of getting their own pandas for just their private collections, as well as museums who want their own pandas, not they don't want the field museum to be the only one. And then, of course, there's the cubs for zoos. And for Ted and Kermit, this is very upsetting because they are aware of just how rare the panda actually is. There are not very many of them in the wild. Even today, I mean, there's less than 2,000 animals that you can find in the Chinese wilderness. This has never been an abundant mammal in our recent history. And it wasn't then either. And so there's really a lot of fear for them about what's going to happen. Um, and you see there's this really poignant moment where they are sitting with a woman named Ruth Harkness, and she has just brought the first panda cub back to the United States. She's about to auction it off to zoos to see where it will land. And Ted and Kermit go to see her in her hotel room, and they're holding this panda cub. And one of the men in the room says, "Oh, maybe one day this animal will be stuffed, much like your trophies in the Field Museum." And Ted is adamant. He says, "I'd sooner stuff my own son." They really realize at this point what they've done. And things change after this. So Kermit ends up taking a position with the New York Zoological Society, and they have this expedition to the Galapagos Islands where they are studying the Galapagos tortoise, which at that time and today is endangered. And they decide that instead of going and killing the tortoise or even bringing live ones for a zoo, they decide to initiate a breeding program. And so it's a very different approach to studying endangered animals than had been done previously. And he ends up making a lot of changes. So then Kermit ends up becoming president of the Audubon Society. And as part of that role, he speaks with Chinese officials and institutes protections for the panda so that it can't be hunted and that cubs can't be taken into the United States. And Ted makes changes in his life too. So we see just through their letters and their journals that they had very strong feelings about the panda and they had some serious regrets about what they had done. And both of them look for redemption in different ways.
Yeah, indeed. It's a fascinating story, and the depth you go into it and the richness. not just the story in itself, but what it's led to in the future. Because I imagine like organisations like the WWF, for instance, were influenced by a lot of these things as well. And it's like fascinating to see. Like, I didn't know until reading part of the book I read that the panda was even endangered even then. I thought it was more to do with human conservation, which is to a point, but it seemed to be an issue of pandas even then, like before that happened.
Hmm. Yes, no, I know the panda has become this symbol of conservation really because of this expedition. This is the expedition that introduced the panda to the West, but it's also the actions of the Roosevelts that then influenced the protection of this species at a time when that was simply not the norm. When you had other species that also became endangered or extinct and didn't have any protections, but the panda, because it became so beloved, has these protections. And it's so interesting to see how, in such a short period of time, the animal is introduced to Westerners, becomes beloved, and immediately these protections are put into place. It's very different than animals such as the sea otter, which also was struggling with right on the edge of extinction at that same time.
Indeed, indeed. So it's a fascinating book. I'll leave a link at the bottom in regards to where people can buy it. Briefly though, before we finish the interview, just want to talk a little bit about yourself and your writing as well. You listed some of the books that you've written, well, subjects that you've written about. This is your fifth book. Do you have any plans already for a sixth book? And if so, could you give us a preview as to what that sixth book going to be about?
Yeah, there's a book I'm writing now, but it's still kind of in early stages, so it's kind of a mess in my brain. It's still kind of all crazy in there. But I just love writing about history and science, and I really enjoyed being able to discuss animals in this book in particular. It was so much fun for me to be able to get into just interesting species that you wouldn't hear about usually, like the Himalayan snowball plant and these dolphins that they find in a Chinese river, and there golden monkeys. There's so many different species that they encountered in this book that was really fun to write about, and I just enjoyed that very much. So I'm really fortunate to be able to pursue topics in history that interest me. And I also do some ghostwriting as well, which is fun for me. It's kind of a nice way to write books without any ego attached, where all you care about is the story. So yeah, I feel fortunate to work on so many great projects.
Yeah, cool. If people want to find out more about your work, where can they go?
You can find me on Instagram. I'm Nathalia Holt, or at my website, nathaliaholt.com.
Cool. Right. I'll leave a link to both of those in the description below. Nathalia, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this. It's really been fascinating. I know you're a busy person, so thank you for coming and doing the 286 Project podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.